Alrighty, guys, welcome everybody. Put your hands up if you can all hear me. Put your hands up if everybody can hear me. Welcome everybody. Extremely excited to see all of you guys. And unfortunately, I've had to turn the comment section off just because we have, I think over 400 people, actually, sorry, 300 and something people in. And I think we're anticipating probably another 300 people, you know what I mean? But yeah, how's everyone going today? I'll turn on comments just a little bit. I want you to comment down below if you're from Scholarly. Okay, I want to see some Scholarly Army. Comment down below if you're part of the Scholarly Army. Scholarly Army, yes. Awesome, cool. So I want to welcome everybody here. I know there are kids here who are in year 4, year 5, year 6. I think it's going to be beneficial to all of you. Without further ado, I also want to introduce the agenda for today, as well as our guest, Sid Cowra, who is a GAMSAT extraordinaire. So I don't know if you guys know about the GAMSAT, but it's one of the most difficult medical exams to do, the medical entrance exam. And Sid's actually scored in the top percentile, the 100th percentile, right? So crazy good. And he's also a graduate from North Sydney Boys. And so we're just going to speak on different aspects of how to choose selective schools. Both me and Sid, obviously both sat the selective schools test. I went to a private school instead. Sid went to North Sydney Boys, but Sid has a lot of insight. He's talked to hundreds of parents. And not only that, he's had a lot of exposure to kids from selective school, being a selective school kid himself. And so we're going to talk about the ins and outs, kind of secrets that a lot of you guys might not know about, such as, you know, programs at certain schools that allow you to do the HSC in year 11, in year 10, how to pick schools, you know, all of these kinds of things. So I think we're just going to wait a little bit longer for people to come in, because we still have a lot more people coming in. But Sid, you want to introduce yourself a little bit? Tell everyone about your background, you know, what schools you went to, what was North Sydney Boys like, just so that we can hear the audience a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for I think Steve hyped me up a bit too much, but yeah, nice to meet you all. I'm Sid, so I went to North Sydney Boys, and I'm currently on my way to studying medicine. And essentially, my background, I just did selective. I didn't get into OC, so I know a lot of people think, oh, OC is the one way to get selective, but didn't get into OC. Did the selective exam, got into North Sydney Boys. Just kind of scraped in. I thought, getting into North Sydney Boys, I wasn't one of the, top people, but ended up doing quite well for the HSC. Just put in a lot of effort, a lot of reps, a lot of hard work. Then I'm doing my degree in neuroscience now at NSW, and then soon I'm going to be potentially going into USyd Medicine, which is the top university for medicine in Australia, and that will probably be next year or the year after.
Yeah. So Sid is actually Sid's very smart. But unfortunately, because he didn't pass the ATAR requirement, he's not hired as a tutor at Scholarly. So, he'll just be sharing some insights, but obviously he's not a Scholarly tutor, you know what I mean? But yeah, Sid's great. Sid knows a lot. And he's very smart as well. Okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll start off by kind of going through the agenda for today. I'll list out all the different things that we're going to be talking about. And then we'll kind of go through them one by one. I will be opening up the chat to Q&A at a later point today. So not immediately, but I definitely will be opening up the Q&A so that you guys can ask your questions. So whatever questions you have, just make sure you save them. I'd say about 20-30 minutes from now, after we've gone through all of these points one by one, I'll go through, obviously Q&A and try to explain or answer as many of your questions as possible. Okay, so let me share the Word doc with you guys and let's jump in. So I've heard from a lot of parents. A lot of parents are very worried about, how do you go about selecting the right school? Okay, like the number one question that I get every single day is, Stephen, with these new changes, we don't actually know what the exact score is. We can only see the bands of top 10%, top 15%, things like that. How do you actually, select the right school? How do you go about finding the right school? How do you go about, choosing the right school when there's so little transparency around marks? So I'm going to try to answer that for you guys today. And the way that I'm going to answer that is we're going to start off with the top 10 schools, okay, and kind of explain how the new grading system works and what measures you can take to kind of assess where your child is at. So the very first thing that you need to understand is that the selective schools test is completely based on supply and demand. So the more kids who put in James Threws as the first option basically drives up the James Threws cutoff score, okay? The other thing that we know is that most of the marks that are allocated to these schools are most likely going to be quite similar to marks from previous years. So even though there isn't currently a list of the exact cutoffs that are required for each school, we can use lists like the HSC results, as well as the cutoff scores from previous years to kind of gauge where the, what schools take in what, and just the general order of things, okay? So my answer to a lot of parents who are wondering, how do you actually go about selecting schools is, number one, have a look at obviously the HSC results list. Okay, that's a very important list. Have a look at obviously the 2019, selective scores list. Okay, so have a look at the selective school entrance scores list. That'll really, really help you guys understand things as well. And you can find these lists basically everywhere. So for example, if you go on selectivetutoring.com.au, you should be able to find a lot of these lists with a minimum score, or all of them ranked. I'm pretty sure on certain places like what's been called Better Education also have these lists available. And so it's very, very important that you guys just familiarize yourself with these lists so that you're aware of where generally most schools are ranked. Okay, so that's the very first thing that you have to do. In terms of how do you go about selecting schools, the number one thing that I tell parents is you always want to, it really depends on what your risk tolerance is as well, okay? So generally speaking, most of you will have an idea of what school your child is able to get into. And so the way that I tell most parents is what you should do is you should align your school's choices with your child's coaching. So depending on what coaching you're currently going to, whether you're going to a pre-uni trial test, or let's say you're doing the ASAT, or let's say you're doing Scholarly trial test, getting insight there as to what a safe bet is, okay? What a, like a risky bet is, and also adjusting to your risk tolerance, right? So there are a lot of factors that are kind of involved here. Obviously, if your child is scoring around the 70 to 80% mark at Scholarly, then you can really apply to any of the top 10 schools. If you're scoring around 85% in the Scholarly exams, then you can obviously, or above, then you can go for more of the James Threws / Borkham Hills type schools, okay? So really also depends on your risk tolerance, how you want to order the schools. Some parents, have this strategy where they choose schools that are very close together. Okay, so for example, if we were taking the list here, you would choose, like, let's say some parents would put James Threws followed by Borkham Hills. Okay, I personally don't really recommend that unless your child is already operating at a very, very high level. I think it's always better to have a bit of a gap between these schools. Okay, so that's just kind of like a general gist. Obviously, we'll talk about how to go about selecting schools in a second, a little bit more. I think we need to take into mind a lot of different factors like geography, a lot of different factors like risk tolerance and all that kind of stuff as well as how your child performed in the test, okay? Because there's also like information that you guys need to understand where children might not perform as well in the test as well as they do in the trial test, or your child might actually perform better than they do in the trial test. So it really, really depends on a whole bunch of different factors. And so we'll try to get through all of this soon. Now, before we go through the actual school selection and how to go about doing that, what I want to do is I want to spend the first kind of 20 to 30 minutes actually talking about each individual school, because I think right now there are a lot of parents who don't actually understand, the different nuances and the different, the different things that are involved in the different selective schools. Okay, so I think what we'll do right now is we'll just go through each one of the schools one by one, and we'll talk about what their strengths, what their weaknesses are, and things to basically know. Okay, so Sid, I think we'll start at the top of the list, and we'll start with James Threws. Okay, so Sid, obviously you've had a lot of experience with James Threws. I'm definitely going to add to your insights What do you think of James Roos as a school? Okay, obviously we all know that it's number one, but what are some things that parents don't really know about James Roos?
Yeah, I think when it comes to James, just a lot of parents get really scared off by the fact that it's really, really pushy, really, really academically intense. I think it's the way, I guess, selective schools, they all work, and the reason that everyone gets a good mark is the environment. Now, if it's not that the school pushes the children, it's that you're surrounded by other children who also really want to work hard. To put into perspective, that the median ATAR at James Roos is a 99.2. So what this means is basically the middle kid at James Roos is in the top 0.8% of the state. Now, I went to North Sydney Boys, which is the number 2 school, and the median ATAR drops to like a 97, right? I personally got a 99.15. So to put in perspective, I was one of the top kids at North Sydney Boys, but at James Roos, I'd be just a middle kid. That doesn't mean like like I'm bad. It just means that the average James Roos kid is really good, not because they're being pushed by the teachers, but because everyone around them is really pushing hard. A lot of other things you guys might not know is James Roos has a lot of language programs like Latin. They have a lot of different language programs. They have a lot of other opportunities, but I guess the main thing, James, like for example, in year 10, kids can do this competition like the Brain Bee Neuroscience competition. So James Roos enrolls all their kids in all of these different competitions like the UNSW math competition, Australian Math Olympiad, neuroscience competition. So there's a lot more opportunities there. You know, maybe a lot of you kids don't even consider something like doing something like Latin or learning it. James Roos provides these opportunities. Now, the last thing I want to go to is if you look at the top degrees in, I guess, for example, UNSW medicine, this is like one of the top degrees you can do as an undergraduate degree in all of New South Wales. This is the best thing. Now, each year, around 70 to 80 children coming straight from high school make it to this degree. 40 of these children come from James Roos. To put it in perspective, from North Sydney Boys, only 2 kids made it to UNSW medicine. From North Sydney Girls, 1 kid made it to UNSW medicine. Some of the private schools, it's always like 1 or 2 kids. The ducks of each school make it to UNSW medicine. James Roos, it's 30 kids every year make it to UNSW medicine. So again, it's not because the teachers are pushing them, it's because everyone really just wants to work hard. They have a lot more opportunities when it comes to all these extracurricular competitions.
Yeah. So as I was going to add on to that, that's a really interesting statistic because people often think that, hey, you know, James Roos kids, North Sydney Boys is not that big of an academic difference, when I would actually argue that there's quite a significant academic difference, as Sid's just mentioned. Okay. In terms of medicine, which I know some parents are interested in, some other parents aren't so interested in, James Roos does have the most amount of kids who get into a medical program, I'd say like all over Australia, right? Because there's like what 30, 40 kids who get into UNSW medicine. There's probably another like 40 kids who end up getting into interstate programs, Newcastle, etc. Right?
Yeah,
Sid?
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I think to add on to what Sid said, a lot of parents aren't actually aware that James Roos actually offers a lot of really great programs in terms of you know, languages. So the 2 main languages at James Roos are Japanese and Latin. I would actually say that James Roos is one of the only kind of selective schools that does really, really well in terms of languages. Okay. Typically, this is something that Sydney Grammar is pretty renowned for, but James Roos does have quite a powerful kind of Latin course. And obviously you can see that here with the elective study, the Latin continuous course, and they also have all of these Latin competitions and Latin excursions. Why is this important? Because again, Latin as an HSC subject is quite a powerful subject to do, because even though it is quite competitive, a lot of private school kids do Latin. Most of the private school kids who end up doing Latin often do IB Latin, which is different to HSC Latin. And so the HSC cohort of Latin is actually pretty small. And if you score at the very top of HSC Latin, that's actually very, very good for scaling and getting your marks into that high 99 kind of range. Okay. So these are all just things to note. I think what would be, obviously we can't cover, you know, Roos in like a lot of detail, but it's very important that you guys just go through the website just to understand, you know, the school and understand what it's like a little bit better. Now, one thing that I do that I do want to mention, and I think we need to kind of talk about this, Sid, as well, is what are your thoughts on James Roos? As in, what do you think would have happened if you went to James Roos? Do you think you would have got a better ATAR if you went to James Roos, or do you think you would have gotten a worse ATAR, having considered all the different factors?
I feel it's kind of a double sorted effect, right? At James Roos, I could have potentially just felt like an average kid, and that could potentially be a source of demotivation, right? At North Sydney Boys, throughout high school, I was one of the top kids, and I always wanted to maintain that status, making me push harder. Now, I'm not saying this will be the case for everyone, but for a kid like me who likes that feeling of being towards the top, at James Roos, where I felt average, I may have felt a bit more demotivated. Again, could be very different for person by person. So would it have helped my ATAR? Potentially, but I think, being at North Sydney Boys, or even if I went to another school, being at that top wanted me to maintain that position at the top and do better.
Yeah, yeah. So this is where, for a lot of parents out there, it's very important for you guys to consider and understand what your child's personality is like. Okay, if your child is the type of child who prospers a lot under pressure, and especially if they do well, like let's say, they do well in competition, they do well, like they don't really mind too much being, like kind of second, third, or like fourth best, and they get really motivated by seeing people who are better than them, then James Roos might be the perfect option for them, right? Whereas, there are some parents who might find that the pressure there is a little bit too much. So one thing that I've noticed from a lot of students that I've taught who've ended up going to James Roos is they've told me, like Sid said, the double-edged sword, but the kind of the other side of James Roos that a lot of parents don't realize is that because there is a lot of pressure, a lot of the pressure and a lot of the assessments that are being given are actually quite hard. They're very, very difficult. They're actually, the internal assessments at James Roos are at least 2 or 3 or 4 times harder than North Sydney Boys. And the reason why they have to make it so difficult is to actually differentiate between the kids. Because if they just gave them a North Sydney Boys kind of like level internal assessment, everybody would get 100%, or everybody would do very, very well. And so that actually adds a degree of, I would say, undue stress. Okay. And so this is just something to be aware of. And this is not a problem that just exists in James Roos. There's actually a problem that exists at every single selective school. And I'll explain why in a second as we go into the kind of blue ocean and red ocean strategy. Okay. So the way that I view this, and this has been proven many times over by many, many people, is it's always better to go into a blue ocean where you will kind of gravitate towards the top. Okay, you never want to be caught in a red ocean where there is a lot of competition. And so whenever parents go to a school on reserve, okay, typically what I see is when a parent tries to kind of inch their child into a school, like let's say they get it on the reserve list for North Sydney Boys, and they really, really push their child to get into North Sydney Boys, but they just kind of only scrape in. If they have only just scraped in, oftentimes you're always kind of, like in the bottom half. And it's never really a very good feeling to be in the bottom half of a school, okay? And so my recommendation towards parents is try to pick a school that is at the level of your child. Don't try to go for a school that is beyond the level of your child, because you're really dealing with the next 6 years of education. It's not just a 1-year thing, okay? I've also heard, I have personal friends who have siblings who've gone to schools like James, or who moved from North Sydney Girls to James Roos, and they've moved back just because they couldn't really deal with the pressure. I've had friends who've moved from like 4th Street to, somewhere like Borkham Hills. And again, they can't really deal with the pressure and they go back. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind. I know a lot of parents are, going to be like, well, if my kid gets in James Roos, we're going to go anyway, but just things to be aware of. Okay. Sid, one thing that I also want to talk about in regards to that is also like, I want you to kind of explain what are the differences between, let's say, North Sydney Boys versus Borkham Hills, and what's the difference between Borkham Hills and James Roos? Because I know a lot of parents are probably wondering, like, what's the difference? Isn't it, basically the same? Like, what are the differences apart from just academics that you see at those two schools?
I think with the boys' schools, for example, like Normanhurst, North Sydney Boys, etc. There's a lot more stronger culture of sports there. The sports teams, because it's all complete boys' schools. So, for example, North Sydney Boys, there was like this kind of Falcon pride sports culture, like this like pack of North Sydney Boys. In terms of the academics, I'd say Borkham Hills, North Sydney Boys, quite neck and neck. It's a very different culture though. Right? If you're more into sports, you're more into kind of, technology, geeky things like very boy kind of things, traditionally boy things. North Sydney boys you'd like. Borkham Hills is a lot great for, I guess, more music, more kind of co-ed activities. So the culture would be slightly different.
Okay, can you speak on, and this is more of a contentious topic, but can you speak on what was the demographic like at North Sydney Boys? Because one thing that I like to talk about with a lot of parents is I like to talk about like how area kind of influences the demographic, and area probably also influences the kind of behavior, personality traits of various students. So what have you noticed? Like, is there any difference going to a school in the Northwest, like Borkham Hills, versus going to a school in the North Shore? And if
Yeah.
so, what are the differences?
Okay, cool. So at North Sydney Boys, my background personally is Indian. I'd say there was probably only 5 Indians in the whole grade of North Sydney Boys. The rest would be Chinese, bit Korean, but mostly everyone's Chinese. In terms of where these people are from, it's usually like, Epping, kind of Hornsby, Chatswood sort of areas. Now with Borkham Hills, everyone I know who's gone there, they're all from the Hills area, Northwest, Castle Hill, Kellyville, Rouseville, etc. And a lot more Indians. I think there was probably 30, 40 Indians at Borkham Hills, probably a lot more. Not to mention, Bangladeshi, Pakistani people, a lot more of that at Borkham Hills. So Borkham Hills, I'd say, was a lot more multicultural.
Okay. How do you think that influenced you? I know this is, obviously, do you think that influenced you in any kind of way? Would you have liked it to be more multicultural? How would you reflect on your experience at North Sydney Boys?
I guess it would have been nice to have as well a bit more other Indians to make, because I feel, Indian making friend with Indian is a different kind of bond. Same with the Chinese with another Chinese. It's you get this different sort of bond. So I would have potentially liked a bit more Indians. Maybe if I went to Borkham Hills, I would have created some more long-lasting friends because, right now a lot of my friends, it's just a different kind of lifestyle we have, a different kind of culture. So my friends will mainly just like I had them in high school, kind of finished them in high school. If I made Indian friends, potentially could have continued.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Okay, so in terms of now the next question that I have for you, Sid, is more so around travel time, right? Because what I've noticed is that Borkham Hills is just super convenient for loads of parents, right? Loads of parents are just like Borkham Hills is like right on their doorstep, whereas something like North Sydney Boys is really, really far away. So let's say if you're a parent, and I know a lot of parents are wondering this as well, if you're a parent and you have the choice of going to North Sydney Boys or Borkham Hills, factoring in travel time, how does travel time influence things? What are your thoughts there? What do you reckon?
Cool.
Would you?
So I think again this is a double-edged sword as well. So going to North Sydney Boys now, I'm not sure if people know, but there's a metro now which goes from the hills. It takes you to Chatswood, and they're actually by 2024, they're extending this metro line, so it goes down to Crow's Nest, which is exactly where North Sydney Boys is. So say from Castle Hill Station or even Rouse Hill Kellyville Station to get to Crow's Nest would only be a 40-minute run. Now, in the grand scheme of things, that's not a big deal, and I'll explain why it's a double-edged sword, Steve. So for example, going to North Sydney Boys, my local swimming pool, where we went for the swimming carnival every year, was right under the harbour bridge. Now, going to Borkham Hills, you would not have that same level of experience. My local park was Camaray Park, where it was a waterfront view. So going to North Sydney Boys, I get to explore Sydney, see all the harbour side, go across the bridge every day, and that in itself is quite nice. But again, Borkham Hills, if I went to that school, it would have been a 10-minute journey every day. So it's one, gave me a lot of experience to see new things. And with the metro, I think coming from the Hills area, it wouldn't be too bad. I'm personally from the Hills area as well. But going to Borkham Hills, again, would have been quicker, but I wouldn't have been able to, do backstroke under the harbour bridge, for example.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's an interesting point, right? Because now, Sid, let's just talk about that point because this is something that I talk to a lot of parents about all the time, which is like, the demographic, the environment that you surround yourself with often ends up building like kind of your personality. And this is why I talk about private schools quite a bit and why I think, private schools are quite good at doing that, even though private schools have their issues as well. But touching on that, how important, because a lot of parents are probably wondering, how important is it that North Sydney Boys and North Sydney Girls is in North Sydney? Like how big of a difference does it make? Like a school is a school, right? Like, does it make a difference if North Sydney Boys is in North Sydney or Borkham Hills is in the Hills area? Does it make any difference or what?
I feel it definitely has a implicit implicit shift in the culture, right? For example, where we hang out after school might be in Chatswood or might be in the city. We might go to the city and grab some food, right? So it's this culture where we're more I guess, experience. We've seen more things in Sydney because I know a lot of my Baulkham Hills friends, they were kind of restricted to that area. You know what I mean? But I guess the North Shore culture, it's going to North Sydney boys, North Sydney girls, that North Shore culture kind of seeps into, I guess, who we think of, I think the stereotype for North Sydney girls, they think, they're kind of the private school, sort of selective school. So they kind of act a little bit more posh, they wear like nicer bags to school, etc., etc. So a bit of that North Shore culture seeps into North Sydney boys, North Sydney girls, since we are on the North Shore. But Baulkham Hills, again, it's a different culture. It's more of they don't have that North Shore kind of vibe where they act a little bit more, hey, I'm from the North Shore, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's actually talk about that because I don't know who's actually interested in that. Do people want us to talk about culture? Put your hands up if you want us to talk about culture. Yes or no? Do people actually want us to talk about the different cultures of schools? Comment down below if you actually want us to talk about that. Yes, 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 no, yes. Okay, cool, cool, cool. I think culture is quite important. I think culture is very, very important. So we'll have a little chat about that right now. Hopefully this doesn't go too late. But anyway, so in terms of culture, I think what Sid touched on, which is North Sydney boys, North Sydney girls, typically what I notice, especially North Sydney girls, more so than North Sydney boys, is the girls from North Sydney girls typically end up being a lot more confident. And some might say that that is attributed to the culture of the school. As Sid's mentioned, a lot of the girls from North Sydney girls kind of view their school as being a private school of some sorts. Okay, the private school of kind of girls selective schools, and that again is a double-edged sword because on the one hand, okay, yes, they're confident. Some people might view it as arrogance, just like you might view certain private schools as being quite arrogant, right? I've been accused of being extremely arrogant on multiple occasions, having talked about my private schools in certain ways. And so some people might view that as being arrogance. Whereas, let's say if you went to somewhere like Baulkham Hills, typically what I find is most of the students from Baulkham Hills are definitely a lot more composed. I would say a lot more level-headed, right? Extremely nice. Not really any ego. And again, this is more of a generalization, but this is the culture, right? Like Sid, you want to add on to that like a little bit in terms of how people turn out and the cultural differences between Baulkham Hills and North Sydney boys.
I agree. I think from what I've noticed, again, I think the Baulkham Hills kids were always a little bit more obedient. I guess they're not, going out doing crazy things, again, because they kind of feel like they're more close to home at Baulkham Hills. They've gone out less, right? Versus the North Sydney girls kind of culture and even North Sydney boys to an extent, we're going out, we're traveling far from home every single day. So it's like, oh wow, we can act in this way, or not act in this like in a bad way, but more just try different things, do different things as well. After school, maybe do something out that we would not have done at Baulkham Hills. So I guess as a general thing, Baulkham Hills people I've noticed are a little bit more humble, nice, versus the North Sydney boys, North Sydney girls culture. Not to say it's a bad thing, because if you look at, I guess, how the people verbalize themselves, right? Like people from North Sydney boys or North Sydney girls, say in an interview, would potentially be a lot more confident and hold themselves to a higher standard, I guess.
Yeah, which is actually quite interesting because I think there's definitely a shift in James Feruz as well. Because I remember, I'd say 10, 15 years ago when, I was kind of first entering high school and just like looking at, different things then. James Feruz, at that point in time, I remember going to a debating competition. It was a debating competition between my school and James Feruz. And to be completely frank, the public speaking at James Feruz was just very, very poor back in the day. Like that was just my personal opinion. Even though it was a friendly match, they just, their speaking ability wasn't very high. Okay. Whereas now what I've noticed over the last kind of 5 to 10 years is a huge trend where James Feruz is actually getting a lot better at public speaking. They're getting a lot better at debating. And because they have the academic chops to back themselves up, I would actually say that that's why a lot of those kids end up getting the UNSW medicine, passing the UNSW medicine interview. Whereas let's say a lot of the kids at North Sydney boys, North Sydney girls, might not, because they might not have the academic chops to back themselves up and they don't put in the actual, work, you know what I mean? And this is just, again, generalizations, just opinions. You know what I mean? Like Sid, would you agree with that, or like
Yeah, 100% I agree. I think interview process is really undermined. And I think, say, someone coming from North Sydney boys, North Sydney girls might be able to speak well in an interview. It all comes down to, do they have the marks to back them up? Most kids don't really have the marks to back themselves up coming from those other schools that are less than James Roos.
Yeah, and we're talking specifically about UNSW medicine. We're not talking about like Newcastle or New England medicine. We're not talking about any of that, or UWS medicine, which is like they're all fine institutions. Like Sid, you could probably talk more about different medical schools, and
Yeah,
I think any medical school in New South Wales would be considered a
good.
fine institution, right? Yeah.
Yeah, very good, very good. They're all quite good. But UNSW medicine has its reputation for its reason. But say you're at another school, law, other things like that, still really, if you're at North Sydney boys, North Sydney girls, there's no issue to get law or something if you're in the top 20, top 10.
Okay, cool. I think what we'll do is, because we've kind of covered one section, we'll kind of work down the list. We've talked about North Sydney boys, North Sydney girls, James Drews, all that kind of stuff. I'm going to open it up to questions. Okay. So again, hopefully parents are the ones watching this. So parents, you can kind of take over, ask some questions. I'm going to open up the chat for like 30 seconds. So please prepare your questions, write them in. I don't want any irrelevant comments and just anything in regards to things that we just talked about. Okay. So chat's open. Let's go. Any questions? Okay. Cool. Okay. Okay, cool. I'll open it up for a little bit longer. And yes, we'll definitely talk about Sydney boys, Hornsby girls, all that kind of stuff. And I'll talk a little bit more about the red ocean strategy and blue ocean strategy and stuff like that. Okay, cool. All right, cool. So I'll try to explain this in a way, and again, this is my own theory. You guys might not agree with it, but this is what I believe, okay? So in business, there is a blue ocean strategy where you want to go into markets that are basically, there's no competition at all, right? And try to launch a new product set. There's also a red ocean strategy where you can basically open a business that is extremely competitive in a very competitive market. Now, if you talk to any billionaire, they basically say the best thing to do is to go into blue oceans, right? Unless you're very, very talented, got some mad innovation, then you go into red ocean, right? Now, when it comes to schools, the way that I look at it, it's very, very similar, right? You don't ever want to go into an overly saturated and overly competitive market or an overly competitive place, okay? And the reason that you don't want to do that is because you're basically going to be competing with everybody else. It's going to be extremely difficult, and you're basically going to sink down. Like the way that business people say this is basically, if you get into a price war with somebody, then profits basically just get eaten away, because price just gets lower, lower, and profits get eaten away. Now, how it relates to choosing schools is obviously you need to assess the level of your child. You need to assess the level of the school, and then base your strategy on going to a school where your child is going to shine. Okay. So let's say, for example, your child is scoring about 65%, 70% in the typical trial test. In the pre-uni, general, trial tests out of like 2,000 people, they're ranked like 400 or 500. And your goal is, I must go to James Drews. Okay. Your whole thing is, I have to go to James Drews, don't want to go anywhere else, James Drews, right? Now that to me is kind of like a losing strategy. The reason why you don't want to do that is because even if you, let's say by stroke of luck, let's say you get into James Drews, even if you do get into James Drews, you're just going to sink down to the bottom. So what's the point in doing that? It's much better, like let's say if you're ranked 400 or 500 in the pre-uni trial test out of 2,000 people, to go to a school like, let's say, hey, let's aim for Baulkham Hills, or let's aim for Sydney boys, or let's aim for Hornsby girls. Let's go there and be in the top 20. That's what I mean by the red ocean, blue ocean strategy. Go somewhere where you're going to do well, where you're going to kind of sink up to the top. Sorry, not sink up to the top, rise up to the top. Okay. Don't join an organization where you're going to be the worst. Okay. So that's kind of what I mean by the red ocean, blue ocean strategy. Okay. Now, where it gets really interesting is a lot of parents sometimes underestimate their child's ability. So sometimes parents might think, oh, my child's ranked 400 out of 2,000 at pre-uni in the pre-uni trial test, or my child's outside of the leadership board at Scholarly. Oh no, they're not going to ever be able to get into a selective school, right? That's wrong, right? Or because again, you need to factor in things like how much time do you have left? If you have like 6 months left, 7 months left, 9 months left before the selective, or a year left before selective, that's actually a lot of time to make huge changes, right? So let's say even if you rank 400, 500, or let's say, you're ranked in the top 25 percentile, you can very easily with hard work get into like a top 5 selective school. You know what I mean? So it really depends on what your situation is. But obviously for parents who are choosing their schools, I would say adopt more of a blue ocean strategy, find a school where your child's going to go up to the top. Sid, do you have any comments on that? Do you agree, disagree? What do you
I
think?
think I strongly agree because I know, I stayed in contact, for example, in my primary school. I was the only child who went to a selective school, North Sydney Boys, but I stayed in contact with the equal ducks with me. This girl, Justine, I remember her name. She was really, really smart, even smarter than me. And she just went to the local Catholic school that I was supposed to go to. I met her 6 years later at UNSW because I was part of this thing called the Talented Students Program, where if you've scored above a 99 ATAR, you get invited to this. This same girl who I was friends with in primary school, who topped the grade with me at that primary school, was also there. So that just said to me, wow, she was probably at the top of the Catholic school that I was supposed to go to as well. And we meet 6 years later as well. So she would have been, I guess, the big fish in a small ocean, and we ended up getting the exact same marks, even though that I went to North Sydney Boys.
Yeah. So there we go. Sid, can you comment on, because I know a lot of parents are going to worry and say, okay, well, what if we go to a local Catholic school? Or let's say we go to a local government school. What if we don't have the competition? Like, what would you say to that? Like how much do you think you learned at North Sydney Boys, in other words, versus how much did you learn from coaching, tutoring? I know you didn't go tutoring that much, but if you were able to comment on the,
I think this definitely comes down to the environment. A very, very specific type of kid can still do well at a public school or Catholic. Your general kid, like I have this strong mentality. A child who got a 95 ATAR at a regular public school could have gotten a 98 or a 99 if they went to a selective. It's as simple as that. They would have been around a much better culture. I have friends who went to North Sydney Boys. At the bottom of the grade, they got the lowest kid at my school gets a 90 ATAR. If I put that same kid with no work ethic, nothing, in a public school, they get an 85, 80 ATAR. So I think it's a lot easier to do well in a selective school because you're surrounded by other like-minded individuals. But it takes a very, very specific person, like, for example, Justine, to do well in a public school. It's possible, but a lot harder.
Yeah. The thing that I would add there is if you go to the same tutoring colleges and the same tutoring places that the other kids go to, like let's say if you're at a public school and you go to the same tutoring colleges that the other, really smart kids go to, generally you will be surrounded by the same kind of people. But again, it just depends. You know what I mean? Like, if you want to surround yourself 6 hours a day with that, or like an hour a day, 2 hours a day, that kind of thing. Okay, cool. So I think that's enough in terms of that. We already spent 15 minutes on that. Let's talk about Sydney Boys, Ford Street, Penrith, because I think a lot of parents are asking about that right now. So Sid, talk to me about Sydney Boys, Sydney Girls, thoughts?
Yeah, Sydney Boys, I think they are notorious for being the best sports school. So I'm not sure if you guys know, but Sydney Boys, they actually compete with all the private schools, and sports is mandatory in Sydney Boys. You have to pick a sport. So I know a lot of boys from the rugby team, the cricket team, a lot of boys from the basketball team, and a lot of these guys, they make it to state. They get, extra sports point in the HC. I'm not sure if you know, but if you do really well in sports, you can get like 5 bonus points as for your ATAR. And a lot of the Sydney Boys get these bonus points simply just because they've done good at sports, but everyone does good at sports at Sydney Boys. So Sydney Boys, really, really good at sports. I think Sydney Girls it's really great for their English, languages, and history. And Sydney Girls, I know for a fact, they really smash Latin. So only a very few schools do Latin. Sydney Girls does Latin. They also smash history. They smash English. They're really good at those humanitarian subjects.
Yeah, I can attest to that. So out of the 100 or so tutors, probably 200 tutors that I've interviewed, the kids who end up doing the best in English usually come from Sydney Girls. Okay, generally the most well-spoken, articulate girls of substance who do a lot of debating typically come from Sydney Girls. Okay, they don't really come from North Sydney Girls. North Sydney Girls, I'd say, is more maths, chemistry, like science orientated. Sydney Boys, unfortunately, does not share the same gift that Sydney Girls has for English. That's just my personal opinion. But Sydney Girls is very, very good at English. And I don't know, maybe they have a strong... Do you know why that is? Because
No idea. I think they just have a lot more like debating, as you mentioned. I know there's like this, they get to go to the Parliament House or something and do some debating speeches. It's always the Sydney girls there. I don't know why, but just seems to be a trend. It's always the Sydney girls.
yeah, yeah. And typically if I had a daughter, I would be more inclined to send my daughter to Sydney girls than North Sydney girls. Simply due to the fact of most other things can be coached, right? English is very difficult to be coached. That's what I think. Okay, so if you really think about that from a selective standpoint, do you really want to send your child to a school, selective school that specializes in maths, all of this other kind of stuff? We can easily go to like a Dr. Do or a, what's another coaching, or a Matrix, or
Kurt,
Kurt
Matrix.
mathematics, right? Whatever, right? So you can go to any of these places to get maths coaching, right? Whereas to get English coaching is very, very difficult. Okay. I mean, you could go to Delta, but again, improving English in year 11 and 12 is extremely difficult. I think the best way is to surround yourself, your child, in an environment with actually going to practice English on a daily basis. Okay. And this is a funny thing. A lot of parents don't actually realize how important English is until like year 11 and 12. And they're like, wow, you know what I mean? So can you comment on that? Because
Well, I can
parents
make
like, oh yeah, English is not that big of a deal. And then you realize, hey, English is the only compulsory subject in HSC.
yeah.
And then, the funny thing is most of the kids who miss out on the 99.95 and who get 99.9, the reason why they get 99.9 at Roos is because they did badly and they didn't get a band 6 in English. That's
Yeah.
the number one reason why, right? So explain. So can you translate?
Yeah, I can speak quite personally on this English topic. So I think at every selective school, everyone, and even all of you guys only probably care about math, science, right? Now everyone will only start caring about English in year 11 and 12. Now I personally did that exact same thing. My mom, she's like, what are you doing? Like when I finally realized that English was important, I started taking tutoring, but it was just way too late by this time. To put it in perspective, everyone is already here for math and science, right? Everyone is already here. You put in this much extra effort. So everyone's math and science is here. Naturally, at a selective school, and English is here. If you put 10 points extra of effort for math and science, your mark might go up to here, right? This is the difference. If you put 10 points extra effort in English, your mark goes up to here. Suddenly, that 10 points extra effort gets you from a 99.1, 99.2 if you put it in math and science to a 99.7, 99.8, right? Every extra mark you put in for mark for English effort, it's an exponential increase in your ATAR, right? The reason because everyone at these selector schools and everyone in general is already doing a lot for math and science, but no one is putting effort for English. So if you put effort for English and you're good at English, your marks just go up like exponentially, right? Like for example, to put it in perspective, for HC for maths, I got a 99 for math advanced and a 49 out of 50 for math extension 1. Now, everyone was just slogging away, putting so much extra effort, and the guy who was so much better than me at math got, instead of a 99 of 100, he got 100 out of 100. Did this affect his marks at all? No, right? If he put that same amount of effort, 5 hours every single day of exercise into English, instead of a 90, he would have gotten a 96 quite easily, and he would have gotten a 99.95. All of the top kids in the top 10 at my school, top 10 at every school, even the only kids who made medicine or even law, they all smashed English because everyone already does good at math.
Yeah. Yeah. So that it's kind of like diminishing returns, right? Like, so once you get like 97 or a 98 and 3-unit maths, the difference
Doesn't
between
matter.
that and 100 doesn't matter. Like you're already at a 99.95 when you get like a 97, like a 49, right, out of 50, or a 48 out of 50. Maybe not 48 out of 50, but 49 out of 50. And what's the raw mark for? I don't know what the raw mark for that, but it's not very high. Whereas for English, most kids at James Roos or any of these, and you can look this up in terms of the number of band 6s. Sometimes even private schools will be competitive with a lot of these selective schools in terms of the number of band 6s they get for English, simply because the focus is all on maths. So there you go. There's like a little blue ocean strategy for you guys right there in terms of focus a little bit more on English. Yeah. Okay. Does anybody have any questions in regards to that? Any questions in regards to English versus maths versus all that kind of stuff? Comment down below if you have any questions. All right, you got it. Okay, cool. Okay, we're gonna stop the chat. Okay, cool. So now let's talk about Fort Street. Actually, sorry. Let's talk about Sydney boys, Sydney girls. Hornsby girls. Thoughts on Hornsby girls, Sid?
Well, it's because it's actually risen up the ranks recently heaps. It used to be like a rank 13 school, rank 14. Then I know they've changed their English faculty and their principal has also changed. So now they're rank 5 religiously every year. They've put, again, they're quite similar to Sydney girls, a lot of emphasis on the English component, but they also have the maths and the science component. So they really stepped up their game in the recent times from being like a rank 10, C tier school, B tier selected to one of the, I think, competitive with, North Sydney boys, those top schools.
Yeah. Um, I would second that notion in regards to Hornsby Girls. My thoughts on Hornsby Girls is, again, it's a great school. I think it's kind of like a hidden gem because I think because of its distance, a lot of kids end up wanting to go to North Sydney Girls or like Baulkham Hills instead of Hornsby. So it's kind of like a little bit forgotten, but it's still a great school. In regards to the specific programs, you guys can definitely Google that online. Okay. Now let's talk about the extension program at North Sydney Boys. So Sid, I was going to talk about the ICT program and how you can accelerate ICT in like year 10. So you
Yeah.
want to speak on that?
So we have an accelerated program for IPT, so ICT, IPT, same thing, and business studies. Now, North Sydney boys every year, there's probably around like I'm not sure how many people do this course, but every year North Sydney boys students get 10 of the state rank. So we get all the highest marks, they're all coming from North Sydney boys because um, you know, us boys, we like tech. So a lot of the North Sydney boys who go to high school, we all like computers tech. They kind of scout you in year 9. If you're good, you pass this little test. By year 10, 11, you can get a state rank just because it's taught really well at our school. Same thing goes for business studies. So those are 2 accelerated subjects.
Okay. Can you expand on how useful it is to accelerate an HSC subject and why there's a high proportion of kids who, because they accelerate IPT in year 10, they finish 2 units. And that's why they actually end up getting 99.95 or close to that because they have more time on other subjects. So can you just explain?
Exactly. So the actual IPT subject, it's not a hard subject. That's why it is very feasible to do it and to do it well in year 10 and year 11. Now, the way a HSC works, you need to do 10 units in your HSC. Now, if you've already knocked off 2 units accelerated in year 10 and 11, that means you have 8 units left. Most of you guys are going to be doing 3 units of math and 2 units of English. That's 5 units done. That means you only have to knock out another 3 units. You can pick one other extra subject, 3 extra units of subjects, so the workload tremendously decreases. A guy like me who did 12 units in the HSC, I had 6 classes every single day and morning and afternoon classes 5 days a week. That was, extremely stressful. So if you can just knock off some of the workload in year 10, year 11, it makes it a lot easier to focus on subjects like English.
Yeah. Yeah. So like in other words, imagine just doing 2 subjects or 3 subjects in year 12 instead of doing like plenty. You know what I mean? Like instead of doing like 5 subjects, it makes a big, big difference. This is actually the big cheat code behind a lot of private schools as well, in that they get their kids to accelerate maths in year 11. They do 3-4 unit maths in year 11, so that in year 12, really they only need to do English, maybe like chemistry and like, music. You know what I mean? So they only need to do 3 subjects, whereas a lot of, ordinary kids at ordinary schools will need to do all 5 subjects, or all 4 subjects and things like that. So again, a couple of little tricks that are involved there. Sid, can you speak on other selective schools that you know of that accelerate certain programs?
Yeah, so I know James Roos accelerates PDHPE and maths, accelerate 2 unit maths. I know Sydney Boys does a business studies one as well. And North Sydney Girls potentially, I think they also do one for accelerated maths. They may have changed it, but I know for a fact James Roos and Baulkham Hills have accelerated for maths and PDHPE.
Yeah, yeah, cool. Okay, so now we're moving into the next kind of bunch of schools. So we're talking about Girraween, Penrith, Fort Street. Thoughts on those 3 schools, comparisons?
Yeah, it's funny story. My brother actually went to Fort Street, and so he gives me, first-hand accounts of that school. The culture astronomically different to your regular select school. Extremely multicultural. A lot of Italians, a lot of Greeks, a lot of just Middle Easterns and Europeans in that school. Insane amounts of emphasis on arts, music, drama. Not to say that they're not a good school. There's a lot of bright kids, but they're bright in not your traditional areas of math, science, but music, drama. All the state ranks for drama, music, they come from schools like Fort Street, simply because there's a lot of that inner West culture. A lot more Greeks, Italians go to this school.
Yeah, I would say I personally like Fort Street the most out of all the schools. If I had a choice of sending my child to either, like I said in another webinar just recently, if I had the choice between James Street or Fort Street, I'd send my kid to Fort Street any day of the week. Okay. Assuming like, I couldn't send them to a private school, I'd send them to Fort Street. Main reason, and everyone's got a different value system. You know what I mean? I just feel like, whatever they're going to learn at James Street, they could probably learn from a tutoring place. They don't need to go there. And instead, the intangible things like speaking, drama, being able to actually communicate with different cultures, being surrounded by different cultures, I think is very, very important, because Australia is a multicultural society. And what's the point in being in a mono kind of syllabic kind of like culture, monoculture, where you only have two predominant cultures when you can be surrounded by all the different cultures? I just think that's very, very important. Sid, can you comment on that also in terms of what you see in university? Because I think a lot of parents don't see this. A lot of parents don't know about that. Talk to me about what is it like for a selective school kid in university? What are the kind of things that, let's say, aren't as pretty, right? That a lot of parents don't know about. And how does that affect kids in the long term?
I think going to a select school, you kind of breeds into what I like to call basically what you touch on, like an echo chamber. So you can, not saying you will, but you can become a bit closed-minded, right? You can think, okay, everyone does computer science, everyone does law, medicine. You've only spoken to Asians or Indians in your life. So going to a university where you're surrounded by everyone now, all multicultural people doing, earth and biological sciences and all sorts of degrees, it can be a bit of a culture shock. And a lot of people, everyone from a selective school only wants to interact with selective school people at university like UNSW. Now, I always notice with the public school kids or even the private school kids or kids, a lot of kids from Fort Street as well, actually, they're a lot more open-minded and willing to interact with everyone. So it's not that someone coming from James Roos, Sydney Boys or North Sydney Boys is, I guess, antisocial per se, but it's they potentially could be a little bit more closed-minded when interacting with other cultures.
Yeah. So that's actually that's a very important point that I've firsthand seen. Look, I think there are a lot of people who James Threws and North Sydney Boys, North Sydney Girls, who make friends outside of their circles. But I'd say the large majority of students tend to stick to themselves. Okay, as opposed to, as Sid said, kids from Fort Street or kids from let's say even more like liberal schools, maybe like Sydney Girls, Sydney Boys. I think they're more open as well. But I think especially when talking about the top 5 selective schools, that's where kids kind of stick to themselves. Now, the reason why, okay, Sid, can you talk a little bit? How do you think this might negatively affect kids? Kids in university, things like that. How might that negatively affect people in the long run?
It's a bit of a wake-up call, I guess, when a selected school kid goes to university. It's like, wow, there's actually other people that exist with different sorts of opinions. Not everyone just plays video games all day and et cetera, et cetera. So people get very comfortable being around like-minded people in a school like North Sydney Boys, James Bruce, Borkham Hills, right? And that obviously will never be the case in a workplace or a university where you're having to work in a group scenario, or like a team project, right? So being just open-minded to other opinions, other people, right? And I've noticed potentially it's a potential thing. Selected school people have a bit more of an ego, right? If they hear someone's not from a selected school, they have a small bias against them, which again, not saying it's going to happen to you. It's a possibility, right? So that's obviously not a good thing for a workplace or a team scenario.
I would argue that a similar issue of ego occurs at private schools as well. So I don't think it's something that only top selective schools experience. I definitely think it's something that private schools experience as well, in terms of ego, in terms of believing that they're better than other people, not wanting to hang out with other people. So it's an issue kind of everywhere. So it's definitely something that I think parents, you guys need to obviously communicate with your kids a little bit more of. Because like later on in society, it's just important to have more of an open mind and be open-minded like to different opportunities and stuff like that. Okay, cool. Can you talk about Girraween and Penrith?
Girraween as well, similar to Hornsby Girls, used to be like a rank 11, rank 12 school, like back 5 years ago. Now it's really shot up its rank. I think it's rank 5 now. either Hornsby's rank 5 or Girraween's rank 4, rank 5. So Hornsby is really, really upped its performance. I think, again, they've changed their principal. So what I've noticed, every time a school changes their principal, they really just start doing well. So Girraween's changed the principal, changed up things in their faculty, reshaped the English department, math department. So they're doing really well lately, and I think they're a really, really great school. Penrith, I think Penrith is also quite good. Again, it offers that co-ed experience. The people coming from Penrith are a lot more humble as compared to the other ones. They're a lot nicer, and it's a great school to be putting down as well.
Yeah, I think Girraween, you might have confused Girraween with Hornsby, Sid. Girraween's kind of ranked outside of the top 20, but I think that's fine. You know what I mean? I just wanted to put that caveat there, depending on how you rank the schools. But yeah, I just want to put that caveat there. Okay, cool. So yeah, as Sid said, you know, those schools are kind of like all kind of good. I'd say the lower, like you go down the list, like when you get to the kind of top 20, top 30, that's when schools tend on average to be a little bit more multicultural, when kids tend to be a little bit more kind of open, tends to be a little bit more similar to a public school and not as elitist. The other thing that I would say about these kind of schools is, again, they're great schools to go to, but they might not be as academically competitive as, let's say, obviously the top 10 schools. Okay. So in terms of like the work ethic, there are obviously going to be some students at these schools. Like, for example, parents ask me about Sydney Tech. What do you think about Sydney Tech, Stephen? Well, again, I know a lot of kids from Sydney Tech. I would argue that a large majority of them didn't really study too much. You know what I mean? They were pretty bright, got at Sydney Tech. The general, you know, mantra at Sydney Tech is just, you know, let's have fun and, you know, party a little bit. So that's why, you know, most of the kids at that school might fall into that rhythm. Okay. So just things to be aware of. When you go to a top 10 school, generally you don't have any issues with like, you know, procrastination or, you know, kind of negative effects towards academics. But once you start getting into like the top 20, the top 30 selective schools, that's when distractions become an issue. That's when even other issues that are more pertinent in public schools, such as drugs, also become a bit of an issue, right? That's not something that I want to mention today, but again, things to be aware of, right? So negative influences, smoking, drugs, alcohol, things like that start to become a little bit more pertinent. Things that you would typically find at like a lowly ranked public school start to kind of seep in. Okay, so those are just things to be aware of. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions from parents? Any questions from parents at all as to any of the stuff that we mentioned? Normanhurst is a great school. Someone just asked about Normanhurst. Sid, you want to talk about Normanhurst?
Normanhurst, I think, a great school. Actually, North Sydney boys competes with Normanhurst in sports, so I've had the privilege of talking to a lot of the boys. I think a lot of them would have put North Sydney boys as their preference, but when I talked to them later, they said no. Like, I love Normanhurst, simply because there's a lot less stress on them. And North Sydney boys, there could be a lot of stress. Personally, I had a lot of stress. Normanhurst, again, a lot more well-rounded. So I think it's kind of like a scale. The higher rank, the more stress, the more intense it is. The lower rank, not necessarily that it's worth, but it's a lot more worse. And you can't do good in the school. It's just a lot more well-rounded, less stress.
Yeah, yeah. It's closer to what we would deem normal. You know what I mean? Yeah. Okay. School assessment marks moderation based on cohort affects ATAR. So good question, Josh. Basically, the only thing that you need to worry about is not the school's rank, but your rank within the school. That's the most important thing, right? So if you're ranked first and you go to like Beverly Hills Girls High School, which is ranked like, I don't know, like 200, 300, 400, or you go to the worst school in the world, it doesn't matter. If you're ranked first in that school, that means you get your own school marks. So you're not going to be influenced or affected by the cohort. The only way you'll be affected by a cohort is, let's say, if you do really, really badly in your school assessments, you get ranked really, really low. Then what happens in the actual exam, you smash the exam, you do very, very well. Then what will actually happen is your marks will get dragged down because your school cohort and what they deem you to be within the school cohort is low based on your school assessments. So the key is, if you go into a kind of like a lower ranked school, just make sure that you're in the top 5. Make sure that you're in the top 10. If you go into, let's say, Clara High and you're in the top 3, you're fine. You know what I mean? You're all good. Because if the top 3 kids are all super duper smart and all your internal assessments, there have been years in Clara High where there've been 399.95s or 299.95s. And that's the thing. So just make sure that you don't do badly in the school assessments and you'll be fine. And it should be pretty easy, I would say, to do well in school assessments over, you know, the final year, as long as, you know, you just make sure that you put in consistent effort. Okay. Scully, can you talk about teachers? honestly, like Sid, I don't know if you'd agree with me. I don't think teachers matter. Like, would you agree with that?
Not much, because like all my teachers from my school have taught at public schools, and they sometimes move to public schools, private schools. So teachers, like honestly, a lot of these kids don't really learn from teachers too much. I'll be honest. Like for maths, the teachers would just kind of put on some exercises on the board, sit on his phone, and be like, "Hey, come to me if you want some help." But most of the kids just do it themselves. So that's what I mentioned a lot. It's to do with the kids you're around.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, teachers, like when you talk about teachers in Australia, it's kind of like, you know, the quality isn't very high. You know what I mean? And that's the case wherever you go. Even when you go to the big grammar schools in like the UK, you know, I'm talking to somebody right now who's going to open up a $1 billion school in Phuket, and he's trying to get the best. It's just hard, you know what I mean, to get good teachers. So in terms of teachers, they don't really influence the school too much. It's mainly the student cohort. Norman Hurst, we already talked about. How do you judge your kids? Okay, so good place to judge your kids is judge their personality. You know what I mean? So Sid, you want to talk about this, like in terms of personality, matching personalities to school, that kind of thing? Yeah.
If you have let's talk about boys first. If you really like sports, Sydney boys, I'd say, is the go. If your boy really likes music, arts, drama, want to explore, maybe play saxophone in the school concerts and stuff, Fort Street is the place to go. If your boy, if you want him to do backstroke under Harbour Bridge, you know, if he's a bit more of a bookworm, you know, really into tech, computers, that sort of thing, North Sydney boys. If you do value a co-ed experience for your boy, and you know you want him to keep him close to home, and you're from the Hills area, Borkham Hills, great school as well. Normanhurst, quite similar to, I think Normanhurst and North Sydney boys have very similar cultures, but Normanhurst tones it down on the level of intensity and pressure in terms of academics, but very similar culture in terms of that kind of boys community, sports, tech, that sort of thing. Now for girls, and you can, you know, button as well, Steve. I think Sydney girls and Hornsby are great if you want to explore more of that English, history, humanitarian side. Sydney girls, especially if you want to explore languages like German, French, Latin, Italian, they offer those really great languages. North Sydney girls is great if you want to put more emphasis on maths, that science side of it. But again, give that kind of North Shore experience where, you know, they're at a private school, but they're not really, but they're at a private school. Then again, same thing for the co-eds, Fort Street, more music orientated, and Hornsby girls really upping the ranks recently, really great at English, and again, keeps them quite close to home.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I got nothing to add to that. I think that's pretty good. Yeah. So, Sydney Tech, we've already talked about it. James Drew's English. All right, James Drew's English. You want to take this one, Sid? I don't want to talk too much about James Drews. Usually, when I talk about James Drews, I get in trouble. You know what I mean? So, you want to talk about James Drews?
James Roos, I'll be very honest. I know kids at James. Okay, there's 140 kids at James Roos in year 12. I'd say every 140 kid has at least one math tutor. 70 of those kids have two math tutors. I'd say every child, maybe 120 out of 140, have an English tutor. These kids go to copious amounts of tutoring. It's not that the school is teaching them, it's that these kids are really desperate for medicine. They're really desperate for the highest marks, and they are willing to put in that work. They see all their friends going. If you saw your friend going to a tutoring for maths and English and science, you'd be like, okay, like maybe I should up my game and do that as well. It's all about the environment you're around.
Yeah, I think the question was more about James Drew's English. Like, what is the English level at James Drew's like? Is it high? How would it compare
I'd
to?
say, yeah, it's definitely quite high. I think because um, traditionally where a boys only school has a much lower level of English. But with the girls included in the James Drews cohort, we had a running joke at North Sydney boys. The only reason James Drews beats us is because they have girls, and the girls are good at English and boys aren't. So that was kind of the running joke, because we're kind of the same at maths, but English is what separates us. So I do genuinely believe that. I genuinely believe, because, you know, I think only 40 people get the top mark for English at North Sydney boys, but 120 people get the top mark for English at James Roos, and it's just the additional fact that they have girls, and girls are a lot more naturally inclined to English.
Yeah, yeah. So if you have a boy and you want them to improve in English, you'd probably send them to James Drews as opposed to North Sydney boys.
Yeah, or a co-ed school. Even Borkham Hills as well has better
Oh, yeah,
English than us.
yeah. Borkham Hills. Yeah, the guy who owns this free plug, what's his name? Satvik. He owns Delta Education. He's from Borkham Hills, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. So there you go, right there. Okay, how about top private schools on the same points? Okay, look, I don't want to talk about private schools today. We're going to talk about private schools tomorrow or the day after. Okay, so basically, Sid, you want to talk about private schools? Out of private schools compared to selective schools?
Yeah, so it's always the private school kids. It's always okay. Your top private school kid, your top selective school kid, your average private school kid. Sorry, your top private school kid, top selective kid, medium selective kid, medium private school kid. The top private school kids are always better than every single selective school kid, but the medium selective school kid is better than the medium private school kid, right? If you're at a top private school, you're like, as Steve was saying earlier, if you're in the top 10 of any school, especially a private school, you're going to be smart. It's always the top kids from private schools who are getting the top ATARs, the state ranks, a lot of the like the top degrees as well. A lot of the scholarships, the Daliel scholarship at UCID, they get a lot of those scholarships coming from private schools. Now, I strongly believe, I did Latin myself, and all of the kids who really smash Latin, who really get the state ranks for English as well, it's always the private school kids year after year. So, Sydney Grammar, Redham, Skeggs, Meriden, it's always those kids doing really well at the top.
Yeah. So I think just to kind of add to that, the majority of the cohort of a private school is nowhere near as good as the average selective school, even like, let's say, a school in the top 20 in terms of academics, if we're just comparing academics. The kids at the very top of a private school are generally all kind of in their own incubator, if you will, because they're kind of like in the top class. And so they're only exposed to really the smart kids. And they generally follow that trend from year 7 all the way to 12. I would say majority of the class, or at least 10 or 12 kids of the class, are very, very intelligent, very, very smart, and possibly at the same level of intelligence of James Drew's, possibly a little bit higher, possibly a little bit lower. I don't know. You know what I mean? But generally, towards the upper echelons. And the reason why is because most of them get scholarships, right? So every private school typically has about 5 to 10 scholarships. Those kids, if they were offered a place at Borkham Hills or James Drew's, I'm not sure if they would go there. You know what I mean? Like, Sid, what would you do? Like, let's say if you had a kid, your kid got in James Drew's or like Borkham Hills, and they got a scholarship to, let's say, like Trinity, like or
Trinity.
like an
Like
ordinary.
Sydney Grammar, I personally, having been to a selective and knowing how important, soft soft skills are, when you're going for an interview or even a job or just making friends or connections, I'd personally go the selective school route, sorry, the scholarship route, like Sydney Grammar, scholarship at Sydney Grammar. Because if they're smart, they're going to be in the top ranks of a private school anyways. So will it make a difference on their marks in the year 12? Not really, no. But I think it helps a lot with other skills like soft skills, communication, if they'll go into debating, public speaking, things like that.
Yeah. One thing that I will say though is that typically the better private schools are the single sex schools. The benefit of going to a co-ed school, I think, is, and this is coming from somebody who's gone to a single sex boys school, is I really wouldn't want the same for my child, okay, to go to a single sex school. I think the reason why is because, again, I think you generally want to go somewhere where boys and girls are, like, everybody's included, right? Multiple nationalities, different genders, boys and girls, you know what I mean? I think that's just generally a better learning environment based on what I've seen with kids as well. You can definitely make the argument that a single sex private school or a single sex selective school, you could argue that the kids are more, concentrate more in class. Do you want to make any comments on that, Sid, in terms of the way that it's funny the way that it was set up, because the private school system was set up to be single sex from like way back like 200 years ago, like 150 years ago, and the Australian system has been adopted largely from the UK, kind of the English system, and that was largely due to boarding, right? Like you have a boarding boys school or a boarding girls school. I'm not sure how well that fares in the modern world nowadays, but again, Sid, what are your opinions on that?
In terms of single sex versus co-ed?
Yeah, versus co-ed, yeah.
I definitely think single sex schools like boys schools, girls schools, they incubate this kind of, oh yeah, boys kind of community. So there's a feeling of belonging, I guess. That's, however, met by the double-edged sword of you're less exposed to other ideas and you're in this echo chamber, right? I've only been exposed to a guy who loves maths and plays video games every night. That's every North Sydney boys in a nutshell, right? I've not been exposed to, a girl who might do other things after school, like, maybe do dancing classes, for example. That's not something I've ever even heard of or thought of, right? So just being exposed to other people helps with being open-minded, and I think that's a trait that goes really, really far for any kind of interview, workplace, anything, just as growing as a person in general.
Yeah, yeah. I would 100% agree. So I would prefer for my kids to be going to a co-ed school. I think the only issue in Sydney is there are not many very good co-ed schools. Okay, like that's kind of like the problem. But anyway, okay, let's talk about Sydney Conservatorium. So someone's asked about Sydney Conservatorium music. Look, I think Sydney Con is great. I think they have a great academic focus now, as opposed to before. You have a lot of really, really smart kids who end up going to Sydney Con, who are very good at music and everything else. The only con of Sydney Con would be that the cohort's usually really small. So there's only about 30 or 40 kids. You know what I mean? Again, this is based on, my knowledge of what it was like 6 years ago, but I assume it's a similar size. It's not very big. So again, like in terms of that open-mindedness, it's unclear as to how open-minded, it is. But again, I can't comment. I think it's a great school. But again, 30, 40 kids, it's a bit of a trade-off. Okay, cool. MLC, all that kind of stuff. We'll talk about everybody, by the way, should turn up to the scholarship webinar that we're running tomorrow or the day after. Okay. So everybody, you guys should all join the scholarship webinar. That's going to be like on another level. We're going to be doing that with Anastasia, who actually got a 99.95 at age 15 or 16. I can't remember. But she's very, very smart. And she has a lot to talk about in terms of private schools, girls' private schools, her experiences going to like different private schools, stuff like that. Best schools for debating: Sydney girls. Sydney, look, boys' schools just typically, in terms of the development curve, I would say that boys just develop a little bit later than girls. Would you agree with that, Sid?
Yeah, definitely. I think again, like your typical boys' school person goes home, does maths homework for 2 hours, and plays video games. Like that's I did that. Like every boy's going to do that.
Yeah. So in terms of debating and speaking, and these aren't typically things that I think selective school boys are innately interested in. It's more so, whereas girls, I think, are quite interested in a lot of these kind of things. Again, we're generalizing, but this is just based on our knowledge. Yeah. How to know your kid's marks is selective. You don't know the marks is selective. They don't really tell you. Really, how much coaching do you have to do for us in a selective school? Sid, you want to answer that question?
Yeah, interesting. So back when I did my select exam, probably like 10 plus years ago, there wasn't much competition, right? Not many people knew about this. It was very kind of niche. It was only guys like my parents came in 20 years ago, so it was just the first generation kids doing it. It's the second generation kids doing it, like myself, right? So I probably did like 2 terms, some light coaching, some workbooks here and there, and it got me into North Sydney boys. That definitely is not the case today. So I've tutored at a couple of different places, and I've seen the work, and it's just there's a lot more people who know about selective now. And as Steve mentioned before, supply and demand. It's just a lot harder because it's not that the test has changed. It's just that they'll take the top people now, and there's a lot more people at the top now because they understand how the test works and they're getting better at it.
Yeah, I would say selective is way more competitive now compared to what it was like, when I did the test, when Sid did the test. It's like way harder, right? Like the test itself is way harder. The competition is way harder. There's more people doing it for like basically the same amount of places. There's not an increase in selective schools. It's based like Sydney, you know what I mean? It's like, Sydney house prices, you know what I mean? They just keep on going up because people just keep on coming to Sydney. So I would say, yeah, it's a lot more difficult, which is also why the amount of training that you need to do to get into a selective school is higher. I think a lot of parents don't actually realize that. And also on top of that, when you're in a selective school, the HSC is actually more difficult now than what it was, when I did it. And it's getting more difficult over the years, again, because it's purely like a ranking system, right? Everything's a ranking system. And kids are getting smarter. Like kids are like, when I started tutoring, like 7, 8, 9 years ago versus how smart the kids are now, big difference, right? It used to be back in the day, a kid could be kind of average, get into like Sydney Grammar on a scholarship, you know what I mean? With just like half a year of tutoring. Now that's not really the case. What do I recommend for parents who don't like that? Move to Melbourne, okay? If you don't want to compete in Sydney, move to Melbourne. Melbourne is a blue ocean. Okay, house prices are like half the price of Sydney. You know, you could easily get into a selective school in Melbourne. And yeah, like you have more options in terms of medicine as well. Monash is pretty easy, right, Sid? Like to get into, as opposed to the New South
Yeah,
Wales.
Monash. Yeah, if you're from Melbourne, getting into Melbourne is a lot easier. So like Monash, Unimel, like La Trobe,
Yeah.
Deakin.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, the blue ocean strategy for you guys in even private school scholarships is so easy to get a private scholarship to Melbourne. Okay, I've had kids who have come to me for coaching for like Melbourne stuff, and I remember this like 4 or 5 years ago. Kids who end up getting like full scholarships in year 4 who would rank probably out of the top 100, top 200 in the scholarly exams. You know what I mean? So like, move to Melbourne. Melbourne is the blue ocean, right? If you find Sydney too competitive, move to Melbourne. Okay. Okay. Cherrybrook Tech. Does anybody have any other questions? I thought that idea about Melbourne was quite special, but it seems like nobody wants to move to Melbourne. Okay. Like Melbourne's just better. Like as a state, it's less competitive. You don't have to worry too much. You know what I mean? House prices are cheap. You can get a new like 2-bedroom apartment for like 400,000. You know what I mean? That's cheap. So like, do that. Okay, what time do we end? Is Barker worth the scholarship? Co-ed? Okay. Do kids in selective schools help each other? Can you answer that question, Sid?
Yeah, 100%. They help each other when the HSC, because the way HSC works, if your whole grade does better, you do better. So after the internal exams, when it's external, so everyone does the common exam for the finals, if everyone's just giving out each other notes, everyone's marking essays for free. I think I used to run after school study groups for biology with my friends, just teaching my friends the whole court, because I was one of the top kids at biology. I used to just say, okay, look, after school from 3:15 to 4 o'clock, I'm just going to teach you guys the whole syllabus. So I wanted to do that. A, because I feel like a good person. B, because it actually helped me get better in the exam. So definitely people do that.
Cool. Awesome. So yeah, if you guys don't know Sid already, I'll just give you guys a brief introduction. Sid is actually our head of customer happiness at Scholarly. So he advises parents on how to go about choosing schools, things like that. He's also in charge of the team that we have of customer service individuals. So yeah, Sid is actually going to be jumping on a lot of kind of webinars that are specific to students within Scholarly. So for all the parents who are within Scholarly right now, if you're in year 4, year 5, even year 6, Sid's going to be jumping on a lot of webinars on our custom LMS over the remainder of this term as well as next term, so that you guys can ask whatever questions you need to him and he'll be able to answer them. Okay, so he's actually been working behind the scenes with me for like the past year. You've been working like the past year at Scholarly, right?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Sid tried to apply as a tutor, but he just, he didn't pass the ATAR requirement of 99.95. So, that's why he, advised his parents on anything. But can everybody just give Sid a massive thank you? Like, thank you, because he's taking time out of, his day to give this. Again, comment down below if you want to see more Sid. Comment down below more Sid if you want to see more Sid. More Sid. Yep. More Sid. Hashtag more Sid. And then we can also do hashtag more Nav as well. Nav's an expert as well on this. So yeah, he'll be doing a webinar anyway pretty soon. Okay, so that is basically it from me today. If you guys do have more questions, turn up to the webinar tomorrow on private scholarships. Even if you're not trying to get into a private school, turn up. I think it's gonna be very, very useful. We have a couple of other webinars going on. We're going pretty crazy with that. So make sure that you turn up. Again, for any parents who are interested in Scholarly, just go on the www.scholarlytraining.com website. Parents who are currently at Scholarly, again, we're going to be helping you guys out as much as possible over the next kind of few weeks and in the eternity. So thank you very much for your support. That is it from me tonight. Thank you guys. Have a great night. And yeah, see you guys. Bye.